So Nenia, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hi, hello everyone. I think I'll start sharing my screen and just to see the cool title slide of my presentation.
Not yet, but yes, now it's fine. Yes, we can see it.
What's it supposed to have? Sorry. Oh, sorry, bear with me. Yeah, okay. So yeah, so hello. Hello everyone. Yes, welcome to this seminar from me too. As Katerina said, my name is Nenia Micha. I am an agricultural economist. I'm a senior research fellow in CCRI. And generally, my research involves the socioeconomic aspects of natural resource management and the development of the rural space. And usually I apply quantitative techniques to various projects, including projects of farmers' response to policies, impact of policies on farmers' welfare, and so on. So today I'll talk to you about this paper that we are developing with the title, The Complex Relations Between Environmental Damage and Farm Productivity, which is a case study of the UK livestock sector. The work is part of NICERED, the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise. And it is a collaborative effort between myself, Dr. Amr Khafagi, who is at the London Metropolitan University, but he used to be in CCRI. And Dr.
Sorry, Nenia, Amr just joined, so welcome, Amr.
Welcome, Amr. Just said your name. And yeah, so Amr, and then we have Serdalu Zusalam from the University of Warwick. And I would like to thank them both for their work and their support, but also great thanks to everyone else who worked for this survey and made this possible. So before I start, just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, it will be a short description of the background of the research and the livestock agriculture. Then the rationale and the objectives. Then I'll talk about the data collection and the conceptual framework. I'll move on to the methodology and how we use the data to create our variables and do the analysis, and then present the results and finish with some key discussion points and some key takeaway messages before we move on to the discussion and the questions. So, sorry. Just to start with the background, I'll present here some facts about livestock agriculture in the world, just to point out its importance across the globe in terms of size, contribution to food security and economics. So in terms of land and size, livestock agriculture occupies around 14 million square kilometers across the earth, which is 77% of agricultural land and 24% of the total land on Earth. We have around 30 billion animals, 25 of which are chicken and 1.4 are cattle. And 32% of this land is considered marginal. So according to FAO, it cannot be used for anything else because of extreme limitations that do not allow land use variability. In terms of contribution to food security, humanity produces 357 million tons of meat worldwide, and 72 million tons of that is cattle and 138 million is poultry. And we produce around 500 billion liters of milk. That covers 28% of total nutrition needs, 18% of the energy supply, and 37% of the protein supply. And the average meat demand is 39 kilograms per capita. But of course, this varies a lot between developed and developing countries. 261 kilograms of milk per capita per year. In terms of economy, it employs 1.3 billion people. That's 1 out of every 6 people on Earth. It produces $1.3 trillion a year. So according to FAO, if it were a country, it would be the 15th strongest global economy. And it constitutes 40% of the global agricultural GDP, but for some countries, it goes up to 80% of the GDP, just to show how important it is for the economy of the world. Moving more locally, the same aspects, I'll talk about the same aspects now for the livestock agriculture, but in the UK. So again, size, a contribution to food security and economics. So in terms of size, 12.4 million hectares, which is 48% of all agricultural land, 240 million animals, 190 million of that is poultry, and only 9.6 million are cattle. And similarly to the rest of the world, nearly 30% of livestock agriculture is on marginal land, or what we call disadvantaged or less favored land, with very little land use change potential. Sorry, there's a delay in slide change. In terms of contribution to food security and food consumption, 1.4 billion liters of milk, 4.1 million tons of meat, close to 1 million is poultry, and 2 million is lamb. It covers 70 to 85% of protein supply needs, and this gap, this difference depends on the area and the income of the population. But in any case, 31% of that comes from red meat and 29% from processed meat. And on average, the average meat demand is 44 kilograms per capita, but only 5% of that is beef. And according to DEFRA 2021 data, the chicken demand has increased by 80% just in the last 3 years. I'm sorry, I don't know why it takes so long to... in terms of economics, it employs close to 500,000 people, 1% of the UK population. It grossly produced 9.14 billion pounds per year, and 15% of that comes from exports. 60% of the total agricultural GDP, 0.5% of the total UK economy. This all showed the importance of livestock agriculture. We need it for our food security, we need it for employment, and it covers the needs in land that cannot be used for anything else. And we could continue producing meat globally, but there is this huge caveat that has to do with the environment. Agriculture, and especially livestock agriculture, is one of the main contributors of global air pollution. And livestock agriculture in particular is highly responsible for a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions, which puts it under scrutiny for its contribution to climate change. The greenhouse gas emissions produced by livestock agriculture are methane, which comes from the enteric fermentation of animals, mainly cattle. Nitrous oxide, which comes from nitrogen inputs and manure management, and carbon dioxide, that comes from the consumption of fossil fuels, mainly from machine operations and farm heating and cooling needs. All of the three contribute to climate change, but they do have some fundamental differences. First of all, just to present some facts for the UK, the methane emissions from livestock agriculture contribute 69% to the national methane emissions and 40% to the national greenhouse gas emissions. But the total amount are 39.1 kilotons per year coming from livestock agriculture. Nitrous dioxide contributes 52% to the total nitrous dioxide emissions of the UK, 57% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And that's 12.5 kilotons per year. while the carbon dioxide emissions only contribute 2% to the national carbon dioxide emissions and 1.7% to the whole emission total. However, the total amount is 195 kilotons per year in absolute numbers. Now, from these three greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous dioxide today are substantially researched, both in academia and in applied research. There is ongoing research on the impact they have on climate change, but also regular revisions of the policies and regulations around them, just to make sure that the efforts to reduce them are being made. Both academic and applied research also investigate the attitudes and beliefs of all the stakeholders, including farmers, towards these emissions, towards the efforts to reduce them. We also research the beliefs on the role of farming in meeting the net zero goals. There's another strand of research that is looking for alternative tools, technologies, means of knowledge transfer to see how we can mitigate them, and so on. We're looking at alternative solutions. And of course, all the above are researched regularly in terms of the impact they would have on farm productivity if change occurred, if we produced less of these emissions, what would happen to farm productivity. However, the same is not the case for emissions coming from fossil fuel consumption. I don't mean that they're never investigated, but they're not investigated to the same extent that the other two gases are. A few alternatives are suggested. The regulations around farm emissions do not necessarily include the carbon dioxide emissions. And one of the arguments for this is that basically the contribution to the total emissions is low, but also because the alternatives so far do not really cover the needs. Moving away from research, there are certain other fundamental real-life differences between the first two gases and CO2. For example, the lifespan of methane is only 12 years. It stays in the atmosphere for 12 years, and then it returns to Earth, and it actually becomes beneficial. And also, methane is only produced by cattle and not by the entire livestock sector. The lifespan of nitrous dioxide is 116 years. It's longer than methane, but still reversible, because 100 years is not that long in the long-term perspective. It doesn't have so long-term effects. While the lifespan of CO2 is thousands of years, so it practically stays in the atmosphere permanently, causing greenhouse gas effects. This does not suggest, of course, that we should be mitigating all three of them, but there is a fundamental difference. At the moment, in the European Union, in the world, in the UK, methane and nitrous dioxide, as we said, are heavily regulated. There are compliance rules with the consumers, with the governments to mitigate them, but this is not exactly the case for CO2. Alternative solutions are constantly being investigated, being developed. I'm not saying they're always successful, but we are trying for the first two. But other than alternative energy resources that so far do not cover the energy needs, not much is being done for the CO2. As a result, the first two, there is evidence from DEFRA and from the World Bank and FAO that the first two are reducing in the UK and globally. But CO2 is increasing. CO2 emissions from agriculture keep increasing, and they will keep increasing in the future. So based on these three differences, the differences between the three gases, basically the first two, as we call them, and CO2, this is where we base the rational aims and objectives of this study. So in terms of the rationale, we are basing it on these 4 facts. First, we assume that productivity is the primary farmer's goal, even if they want to protect the environment, or if they are convinced that they have to protect the environment. We assume here that productivity is always their priority goal because they're businessmen and they have the farm to make money. The second is that CO2 is emitted from fundamental farm operations that cannot be easily stopped. Contrary to the other 2 emissions that, we have alternative land use changes that can help. For CO2, even if you change the land use, machinery will still have to be used. And this is, a core need of the farm. The third is that the reasons behind this aspect of environmental damage, fossil fuel emissions, is complex. It's not that easy to say to a farmer, stop using your machinery because you are damaging the environment. There are complex relations behind that. And the fourth is that finding alternatives so far is complicated. There are alternative energy sources, but they are nowhere near enough to cover the fossil fuel consumption. So we make 2 assumptions for the research. The first is that CO2 emissions at farm level highly affect productivity. And then that farmers' mentality, goals, beliefs, and attitudes affect the CO2 environmental damage. Just to say here that this research examines the livestock sector as a whole, as a meat-producing industry, rather than distinct farming systems. So we're not only looking at cattle and cows. So the aims and objectives. What we're aiming is to understand specifically for CO2 emissions, how the CO2 environmental damage affects the economic turnover in the UK farms in the UK livestock sector. We have these 3 objectives: to define and define CO2 climate change damage and estimate it at farm level, understand the human practices that determine this climate change damage, and they see the impact of this climate change damage on farm economies. The key purpose, given that we believe there is not much research going on so far in this aspect, is to kind of create a baseline to start investigating it and maybe lead to further research. So in order to bring all these concepts together, we created a conceptual framework that encompasses all these aspects in a quantitative way. So the principal idea of the conceptual framework is that climate change damage, as we define it here, so CO2 damage, affects farm productivity, in the sense that there is a positive relationship between them. If climate change damage increases, farm productivity also increases, and the other way around. But of course, knowing that farm productivity is affected by more things, the model becomes like this. So it is farm productivity is affected by climate change damage, but also by farm inputs, labor, size, sales strategy, goals, and gender. Gender is a control variable and is there based on the literature. Evidently, the literature suggests that it might affect farm productivity. So this scheme encompasses our first assumption that climate change damage affects farm productivity. However, if we want to incorporate in the conceptual framework the second assumption, that this climate change damage is affected by farm management and farmers' goals and beliefs, then the conceptual framework becomes like this. So this effectively means that we have 2 different models. First, we have the principal models, what we call the actual situation that we're trying to examine, climate change damage and relation to productivity. But we need to incorporate this condition that this climate change damage depends on farmers' goals and beliefs. So to put it in a different way, the main model means that if a farmer damages the environment, they produce more. However, before we estimate this, we need to establish that it is the farmer that damages the environment and is not damaged by something else. So to actually then transform this conceptual framework into results, we use the specific methodological framework. It is an econometric technique that is based on the utility maximization theory, and it uses regressions to establish the relations between the concepts, as we mentioned them in the conceptual framework. So for the main model, what we said the situation was, the mathematical form would be this: farm productivity depends on climate, which is on the left-hand side, depends on climate change, plus inputs, plus farmers' decisions, farmers' goals, beliefs, labor, and size, and gender that I forgot to put. And this is basically the mathematical form. You have to excuse me because my buzzer is ringing. Just give me 1 second. Truly sorry, but it would go on forever soon. But as we said earlier, we want to make sure that the climate change damage depends on farm practices and farmers' goals and not something else. So we incorporate this conditional model, as we call it, that has this mathematical form. And in order to ensure that one estimation is conditional to the other, we use a technique called the mixed process modeling. And in this technique, we assume that the two equations are correlated in their error terms, although they may seem uncorrelated to each other. They're estimated together simultaneously. And we have this covariant coefficient at the bottom, the ATAN rho, which is tells us if it is significant, it means that this simultaneation estimation made sense. So the main model would be different if we did not have the conditional model. The data we're using to populate these regressions came from the Farm Business Survey of NICE. It was conducted in England. It aimed at farmers in general because it was a large multi-purpose survey, but here we are using the responses from livestock farmers. It was mainly a phone survey. It took place in the summer of 2023 and covered these three regions: the Northwest, the Southeast, and the West Midlands. And in total, we have 351 farmers in this survey. The survey asked specific information that we need for this study: the size, the main farming system of the holdings, the input in terms of fertilizers, pesticides, and energy, fuel use, sales strategies, whether or not they use certain environmentally friendly practices on their farms, and the barriers they face to adopt them, and of course, their economies and income, main goals, objectives, and the way they make their farm management decisions. We used the data that came from the survey to define productivity and climate change damage as we want to use it in this research, and also to formulate the independent variables to populate the two regressions. So the dependent variables are for each model. For the main model is productivity, which is the income from farming activities per hectare. And here we see the statistics. Overall, on average, our farmers produce nearly 600,000 pounds, and that's nearly 1,500 per hectare per year. And the environmental damage is the carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel consumption, which was calculated using the IPCC methodology. And here are the averages. Practically each farm on our sample produces 170 kilograms of CO2 per hectare per year. Moving on to the independent variables, which are basically the quantitative indicators that have the explanatory power. They are divided in three categories: farm inputs, farmers' decision-making, and farmers' goals, attitudes, and beliefs. So first, for farm inputs, here the table presents all the variables we use to indicate these farm inputs. And as they're all quantitative, we describe them here with the means and standard deviation. So in terms of farm inputs, we have here the electricity use as an alternative energy source, the fertilizer inputs, chemical and organic, pesticides and feed concentrates, total labor, and farm size. Just to point out here, all these variables are normalized before they went into the model to have a mean of 0 and a variance of 1. And that was to eliminate the units and to facilitate the interpretation of the results. Then we have the farmers' decision-making. Here we have a list of practices that have been identified in the literature as environmentally friendly. And in the survey, we asked farmers if they use these practices. And the answer was basically yes or no. These practices are no slurry spreading, selling product within 50 miles from the farm, measuring the carbon footprint, regular soil testing, using no-tillage techniques, selling directly to local markets, cooperatives, and independent markets, as opposed to corporate businesses and just selling more locally and directly. And then we have the female management, which only went into the main model. I know it's not farmers' decision-making, but it had to go somewhere, so we put it in this table. So here we have the percentage of the sample that said yes in these questions. What is worth noting in here is that 90% of the sample actually said they do soil tests in one way or another, whereas only 35.6% measure the carbon footprint. Then we have farmers' attitudes and beliefs. The variables that represent farmers' goals, attitudes, and beliefs are composite variables that are the result of a principal component analysis. So just briefly to mention here that the principal component analysis is a quantitative technique that groups together variables in a data set that are highly correlated to each other, but not correlated to the other variables in the data set. So in this case, we asked farmers these 12 things, and we asked them the level of agreement or disagreement in these 12 statements. And then we grouped the responses using principal component analysis that produced these 4 composite variables or principal components. So the first component represents those who try to achieve higher market prices, reduce production costs, maintain profits, and improve product quality. So we call that the economic component. The second was highly correlated with those who want to maintain soil quality, have environmental commitment, and protect water resources, and that's the environment component. Then we have those who have as main goal to comply with the buyer's needs and to adhere with the regulatory procedures, and we named that the compliance component. And then we have those who want to minimize financial risks and maintain steady sales channels, and we call this the risk aversion component. Just to point out very briefly that here we use what we call the non-linear or categorical principal component analysis as opposed to the traditional one, because the variables are qualitative, meaning that they don't have a variance in the traditional sense and they had to be transformed. But anyway, this is the result for composite variables. Now, this process, as we described, it gave us 20 explanatory variables, or independent variables as we call them. They were incorporated in the mixed process model. And now we will present the results. We will start with the conditional model and then move on to the main model. So for the conditional model, here we have the results for the conditional model. What we see in this table is the coefficient and the marginal effect. And the star represents the existence or not of statistical significance, where we have a star or more than one star. The impact of this variable on climate change damage is significant. So for the conditional model, the statistically significant variables are the environmental principal component, so farmers having environmental goals. And then most of the environmentally friendly practices, so not spreading slurry, selling within 50 miles, measuring carbon footprint, soil monitoring, and no tillage. All these practices reduce CO2 emissions on farm. The interpretation of the results is based on the marginal effect, so we are able to have percentage outcomes. And this is what they look like. So the environmental component, if it increases by 1 unit, that would reduce CO2 emissions by 2.6%. Not spreading slurry reduces CO2 emissions by 10.8, selling within 50 miles 17.4, measuring carbon footprint 12.6, soil monitoring 5.5, and no tillage 10.7. The result that is most worth commenting here is the high negative correlation between selling locally and reducing CO2 emissions. That shows the importance of local markets for reducing carbon footprint of the livestock sector. But also the others are just the impact of using environmental practices. If a farm uses all these environmental practices together, the reduction of CO2 emissions is huge. Moving on to the main model. We have the same layout, so we have all the variables, the coefficients, and the marginal effects. We see on the right that the anaerobic, so the covariance coefficient, is statistically significant, which means that there is conditional relation between the two models. And this main model would be different if we didn't have the conditional one. So moving on to the results, we see again the coefficients and the marginal effects. The statistically significant coefficients are, of course, the climate change damage. Increasing climate change damage increases farm turnover, which actually confirms that it does have an impact on productivity. Then we have the environmental principal component, the risk aversion component, the use of electricity, the use of pesticides, total labor, selling within 50 miles, and direct sales that both have a negative impact on productivity. The results again are interpreted based on the marginal effect. So this is a better interpretation. Okay, so the most important finding here, of course, is that climate change, as we defined it here, the CO2 emissions increase farm turnover by 15.6%. We see that having environmental goals reduces it, farm turnover by 1.6%. The use of electricity is expected to increase it. Use of pesticides increase it by 17.9%. Total labor by nearly 8%. And then we have the selling within 50 miles and selling directly. They both reduce it, not a lot. Local markets by 5% and direct sales by 0.4%. But it's still a significant result that the farmer may consider when they try to balance the two things. Another thing worth commenting, I think, is again the local markets. In the previous model, we showed how much they decrease the environmental damage, but the fact that they also decrease productivity by a little, maybe something to think about. We We can come back to these results to discuss them, but first I'll present here some key points as we think they came out from the analysis. So first, and most importantly, the higher the climate change damage, the higher the turnovers. Then the magnitude of this climate change damage correlates to all farm practices. And that proves the second assumption, that it's a complex issue. Direct and local markets reduce both climate change and turnover. What was worth commenting, and I didn't talk about it when I presented the table's result, is that fertilization does not increase productivity. None of the use of the fertilizers was statistically significant. And this is a result to consider both in farm level, but also generally for its meaning for the overall farm emissions when we design policies. Having environmental goals reduce climate change damage, but also decrease productivity. Again, this is something to consider when we design knowledge transfer tools, knowledge transfer methods, just to consider that we need to address them together. And then risk aversion means higher turnover, whatever implications this might be having, both in terms of rural development, but also in terms of energy use. Finally, before we move to the discussion, just some takeaway suggestions. First, we need to more strongly support mechanisms, of course, that increase alternative energy uses and reduce the CO2. We need to create education and advice tools to better inform on the impact of fossil fuel consumption on productivity, but not only on the environment. We need to support investment in local markets, eliminate that reduction of turnover just to avail of that huge reduction of CO2 emissions. Create farming practices that promote both sustainability and productivity together and not one or the other. And then finally, create fully framed regulations that encompass this issue of CO2 emissions from farms in a more effective way. That was all from me. I think we are ready to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Nenia. Perhaps if you can stop sharing
yes,
that would be great. Fantastic. Thank you very much for very interesting and really packed with data presentation. My colleagues in the other room are monitoring the chat, but if there is anyone who would like to sort of ask the question directly, please just raise your hand, and of course we'll give you the opportunity to do so. Annie, you were the first, so please go ahead.
Hello. Sorry I missed the beginning. I was trying to find a quiet place, so apologies, but thank you for that. That was amazing. I had a really quick question about the results where you were showing how much of an effect each element had on reducing CO2. So those ones that said about selling locally and no tillage obviously had quite a high impact, but they're obviously quite active, like you can see they are actionable things that will reduce CO2, and it, you know, that they're the direct reduction. But with the soil monitoring and the carbon measuring, yes, they're active things that are doing, but just a farmer going out and testing their soil isn't directly reducing their CO2. So I was just wondering if you followed that through to see what it was that was actually impacting the reduction in CO2, whether they were changing their practice in some way, or what was it from the results of that monitoring or measuring or something that caused the reduction?
Yes, no, we didn't follow it because this is the data from the survey. So hopefully if we continue the research, but what we assume here is not that because they measure the soil content, then they reduce the fuel consumption, but because they have the attitude overall to take care of their farm, to protect the environment, then if they measure the soil and they see that they don't need fertilization, this of course leads to less operations on the farm. They go out less, they use the tractor less. Knowing the content of your soil means that you are make targeted interventions rather than go out and that increases your fossil fuel consumption for the soil monitoring. The other one was the no tillage.
Yeah, I can see how that reduces it. Yeah, I was just
tillage is done by machinery anyway.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just because I'm looking at the farming attitudes and stuff. So I was interested to know if, like you say, there are lots of options based on what result they get from their soil testing as to what they then do, whether it was reducing the pesticides or reducing the fertilizer or reducing tillage or something, which one it was impacting.
Well, each would have a different approach, but in any case, they reduce the intervention in the farm.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I think there was a question from the room itself, so please go ahead. I don't know who wanted to ask questions from the colleagues in the meeting room.
Yeah, thanks, Nenia, that was great. I just had a question about the fertilizer and pesticide operations. What was kind of boundary of the analysis? Was it just looking at the operations, or did you do any life cycle and build in any life cycle analysis for the fertilizer and pesticide production or inputs? Because if you found that close by markets had an impact, but maybe close by inputs might have had an impact as well.
Yes, you're right. Yes, you're absolutely right about that. It's something that we should have considered, but there were data limitations. Unfortunately, the survey doesn't provide this data, and it was not easy to ask so many details because the survey asked for other things as well. It was not targeted at this paper. It was a massive survey that asked many other things. So we had to cut down on what we could ask for this specific aspect. So yes, we know that there is this limitation. It's just what the farmer uses on farm. We don't know where they buy it and where it ends.
Okay. All right, thanks.
There's a question in the chat from Lisa, Katerina.
Yes. Oh, yes. So Lisa is asking, what is the overall outcome of the GHG emissions? Is it still not CO neutral?
Sorry, could you elaborate a bit more? I don't understand the question.
Lisa, are you there? Lisa is joining all the way from Australia.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the overall outcome of the GHG emissions?
Yeah, the outcome in what sense? Yeah, it's I believe it's not. If it's the calculation of the IPCC CO2 equivalent, it's not zero, if that's the question. Specifically for CO2, it was 170 kilograms per hectare per year per farm. And we have similar calculations for the other two emissions, which just didn't, the other two gases that just didn't go into this presentation. They're not zero, if that's the question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Annie?
Okay, and one in the room.
And one
sorry, if the room wants to go first, because I've already asked a question, but it was just based on Lisa's.
Yeah, for some reason I can't see the room now, so sorry.
Chris has a question.
Oh, okay. I just wondered, and maybe if it's data that Damien's looked at, have you checked to see how this sample fits against a sort of national picture? Because I don't know, maybe I'm out of date, but one thing that stood out for me, 45% of farms with a woman manager, a female manager, that seems extremely high. I thought the number of that was far lower. So I don't know if you've done a comparison of this data against national data to see where's it out of line? Because that seems to be one.
We asked the questions in a slightly different way. So rather than say how the Farm Business Survey would do it, where they only ask for the principal farmer, which tends to be male. What we actually did in this survey was we asked a set of questions about who makes decisions about the farm. And very interestingly, actually, it gives you an entirely different picture of the role of women in farm business decision making.
Excellent. Okay, so I mean that is really very interesting. But the one, I guess, for you, Nenia, it's like proportion of farms that do soil testing, or certainly even carbon footprint. I would have said 35% was quite high. The other data I've seen suggests that they do far less. They're very unaware about the carbon footprint.
Yes, I don't really know how to answer. This is data. This is it comes from the responses that
I know what it's done, but it's about assessing how you've got 61. That's fine, but they may be really far more environmentally aware than the 150,000 we've got in that are in the UK. If there was anything that you've used to compare, that was all.
Well, maybe Amma can come in. Welcome, Amma.
I haven't given any response. I haven't answered any question
yes,
yet.
and then go ahead, Nenia, and then Amma can go ahead as well. So go ahead.
The comparison we have made is like a theoretical comparison with the Farm Business Survey. We do have different numbers, but this doesn't change the validity of the data we have here, because this is basically based on this survey. Now, we know that there are some limitations because we asked more large farms. I don't know why this happened, to be honest, but we have more large farms than small here. And usually larger corporate farms tend to comply more with these regulations than smaller farmers, from what we know. So yes, there is this kind of skew towards, better use of soil testing and all that kind of stuff. We thought of weighting the data, and we might actually, but we still haven't figured out the perfect weighting method, because if we use the DEFRA weights, they skew the results towards other stuff that don't look very good. So we need to figure out how to weight it. That was from me. Amr, you feel free to chip in.
I just first want to say hi, everyone. It's been a long time. No, perfect. I think I just was wondering for the soil monitoring and carbon testing, the yes or no was a translation of have you tested once a year, one every 2 years, or once every 5 years, something like that, right?
It's from 1 to 5. Like if they monitor, if it takes more than 5 years for them to monitor, we put them in the no. But everybody does between every year and every 5 years. 90% of the farmers do. They said they do. I don't know if they
This is why I'm thinking it makes sense, because it's not just once a year, it's for a longer time. So probably more farmers are doing it in the span of 3 years. And also people will say yes, like some people would say yes for the positive practices, of course. Maybe that can explain the.
Yes, and also the question was, do you monitor your soil? Which for everybody may mean something else. Somebody may think they monitor their soil because, they take one sample from one corner and, smell it. And then there may be soil monitoring.
Okay, so we have Francis next, and then we have a couple of things in the chat as well.
I'm not sure whether I've missed this, from the conceptual model to the mathematical models that you had. One thing I noted with the conceptual model, there's just like, it was one directional, climate change damage causing, but no, having an effect on farm productivity, but not any reciprocal relationships, no feedbacks. Like, say, the farm input would affect farm productivity, but depending on what those inputs were, they might also have climate change damage in their production. You get what I mean?
Yes,
it seemed to be very much a one-way model rather than a systems model.
It is the conceptual framework of the regression that we used earlier. There's no causal effect in this regression. The correlations are both ways, always.
Yeah, right, okay.
It doesn't mean that you increase one and the other increases, and this also happens vice versa. It's not causation, it's correlation. What happens in this, why you see the direction that way, is because of the interpretation. So if we increase climate change by 1 unit, then the productivity would increase by so much percent. And this is how we interpret this result. If we did it the other way around, we would have to say, if we increase productivity by 1 unit, climate change damage increases by this much percent, because this is how the coefficient is interpreted.
Right. Okay.
And we chose to interpret it this way because this is what we're looking at.
Okay.
But it's not causal. Yeah, it's not a one-way relation.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the chat from Catherine. Do you think the results would have been different if you had considered farm profitability instead of turnover?
Yes, in simple words, yes, it would be different. This is the variable we have. Again, there is this, this is what happens with quantitative data. You ask a question, you get a response, and then you need to work with that. We ask what the farm turnover is. We presume that they gave us their net turnover, but we don't know. But yes, we think that whatever, if you change the variable, you have different results.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I don't know if they would be better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the follow-up question is, why didn't you ask for profit?
Because we assumed that when we asked for turnover, they gave us their profit. Okay, this was the assumption when we designed the survey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then also there is a comment from Lisa, who thinks that the soil testing is related to NMP rather than soil testing for soil health. But I think it's more of a comment rather than, you know.
No, I agree. Yes, usually the soil testing is to monitor your nutrient management. I completely agree. Yeah.
Katerina, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think we have a time for one more question if anyone's got you know, a burning question to ask. And if not, Chris?
Yeah, sorry, just leave me. So, Nenia, is your sense that, I'd like your comment, why do you think the solutions for, or why do you think carbon dioxide is so neglected then within policy, or there isn't the impetus behind the alternatives? Because if it's fossil fuels, then we know that there are alternatives, but are they being particularly slow within agriculture?
Well, I think, but I have to investigate more, is that because the alternatives are nowhere near covering the needs for energy. So if they reduce productivity so much, it's very hard to say to any kind of industry, but particularly to farmers, stop using fossil fuels, although it reduces your productivity. So it's something that is not touched until there are effective solutions. This is what I believe. But I still don't have strong evidence.
No, I asked you what you thought.
Yeah.
I know that's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating.
So if there aren't any questions, we are nearly really fulfilled the time that we've got for this. So once again, Nenia, thank you very much for an interesting presentation and also quite thought-provoking discussion. So thanks a lot. Thank you everyone who attended, and we'll see you at the next CCRI seminar. Bye then.